1946. Europe lies in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble. Factories bombed out. Millions of people homeless, foodless, hopeless. The most devastating war in human history has just ended. The economies of the world's largest powers are depleted to the point of exhaustion. Every dollar, every ruble, every ton of fuel counts. Resources are being diverted to recovery, to feeding the hungry, to rebuilding the devastated. This is the logic of survival. This is the priority of any rational government. It is at this moment that something inexplicable happens. The United States of America, a country emerging from the war stronger but still exhausted, is launching the largest expedition in the history of polar exploration to the shores of Antarctica. Operation High Jump. I have loaded all available data on this expedition into the analytical system. The scale is staggering. 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea, 23 aircraft, including flying boats and transports, and 4,700 personnel. This isn't a scientific expedition. It's a military armada, an invasion fleet, headed for the most inhospitable continent on the planet. A place where there's nothing but ice, only cold, only death for the unprepared. I've calculated the cost of this operation. Even by the standards of the American economy in 1946, it's a colossal outlay. Fuel for 13 ships for a months-long voyage across 2 oceans A's. Provisions for nearly 5,000 people. Maintenance of aircraft in extreme cold. Specialized equipment for polar operations. Insurance against risks in a region where any accident could become catastrophic. Tens of millions of dollars in 1946 prices. When this money was needed for the Marshall Plan, for the restoration of Europe, to counter Soviet expansion, and for 1,000. Sahabru's critical tasks. And instead, the fleet retreats to the ice, to a deserted continent at the edge of the world. Why? The official story sounds benign. Scientific research, mapping the coast, training personnel in polar conditions. I analyzed this story and dismissed it as untenable. Scientific research doesn't require an aircraft carrier. Mapping doesn't require nearly 5,000 troops. There are Alaska and Greenland for training. Much closer, much cheaper. The scale of the operation is categorically inconsistent with the stated goals. This isn't research, it's a search. A targeted, planned, prioritized search. For something so important that it justifies any expense. Something that hasn't been disclosed to the general public. Something that would change the balance of power on the planet. But the United States isn't the only player in this race. I expanded my analysis and discovered that the Soviet Union was showing an inexplicable interest in Antarctica during those same years. A country that lost 27 million people. A country that lost a third of its national. A country where people were starving and industry lay in ruins. This country was wasting precious resources preparing Antarctic expeditions. Stalin personally oversaw the matter. NKVD and subsequent MGB documents mention a strategic interest in the southern polar region Anvas, an interest that had no obvious military or economic justification. Antarctica has no oil, at least none that is accessible. No minerals that could be extracted. No strategic positions for military bases, nothing to justify. The attention of a dictator busy rebuilding a shattered empire. And yet the attention was intense, constant, and secret. Conspiracy theorists offer explanations. Nazi bases, flying saucers, secret weapons of the Third Reich hidden in the ice. I loaded these theories into the analytical system and rejected them as logically untenable. Let's reason. Nazi Germany was completely defeated by 1945. Its industry is destroyed. Its logistics are paralyzed. Its fleet is sunk. The idea that under these conditions the Germans were able to build a secret base on the other side of the planet, in the most inaccessible place on Earth, and supply it with everything it needs is not a hypothesis. It is a fantasy, a physically impossible fantasy. To build a base in Antarctica, thousands of tons of materials are needed. Fuel is needed. Food is needed. A constant supply flow is needed. Through oceans controlled by the Allies, past radar and patrols, undetected. It is impossible. Mathematically impossible. Logistically impossible. The version about Nazi bases is a myth. A beautiful myth for those who want to believe, but nothing more. The version about flying saucers is even more absurd. If the Nazis had anti-gravity technology, the war would have ended differently. If they had flying saucers, they would have used them to defend Berlin. Technological miracles are not hidden. Technological miracles are used when survival depends on them. Nothing like that happened, so nothing like that existed. The logic is simple. The logic is ruthless. There were no flying saucers. But then what? What were the Americans and the Soviets looking for in the dead ice? What justified expenditures incompatible with economic common sense? What compelled bitter enemies to simultaneously direct resources toward the same continent? I rephrase the question. Not what were they looking for, but what could be of such value? What on this planet is worth more than oil, more gold, more uranium? Only one thing. Control. Control over the planet itself, over the conditions of existence, over the basic parameters of the habitat, over that which determines whether we live or die. I began to think of Antarctica differently, not as a frozen desert, not as a geographical curiosity on the edge of the map, but as a functional element of the planetary system. Why does it exist? What role does it play? What will change if it disappears? The answers to these questions were frightening, and they explain everything. They explain the expeditions, they explain the secrecy, they explain the race between the superpowers, they explain the fear that led to an unprecedented treaty. Yeah. But more on that later. First, some basic physics. Antarctica isn't just ice. It's 26 million cubic kilometers of ice, a number that's hard to comprehend. Let me visualize it. If all the Antarctic ice melted, sea levels would rise by 58 meters, but 58 meters. Every coastal city in the world would be underwater. New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai, every single one. It would be immediate flooding. It would be the end of civilization as we know it. And the only thing standing between us and that end is the Antarctic ice. The white shield at the South Pole. The shield that most people take for granted as something that has always been and always will be, but it isn't. Ice isn't just frozen water. It's an active element of the climate system. I threatened to dissect data on the physical properties of the Antarctic account and discovered an engineering solution. A solution of such scale and elegance that it's hard to dismiss it as. White ice reflects solar radiation. Up to 90% of the energy falling on Antarctica is reflected back into space. Compare this to the ocean, which absorbs 90%. Antarctica is a giant mirror. A mirror with an area of the amphoria of 14 million km. A mirror pointed at the sky, rejecting energy that would otherwise heat the planet they've added. This isn't a metaphor. It's physics. It's the thermoregulation on a planetary scale. I constructed an analogy that helps understand the essence. Imagine the Earth as a server, a giant computing center processing 8 billion biological processes simultaneously. Every living thing is a process consuming resources. The server works. The server heats up. This is inevitable. Solar radiation is a constant influx of energy from the outside. Geothermal heat is energy from within. Without a cooling system, the server will overheat. The processor will burn out. Processes will stop. Life will cease. Antarctica is a cooling system. A radiator, a cooler, is a mechanism that removes excess heat and maintains the temperature within the operating range. Without it, the server will fail. And that's what the superpowers intelligence agencies realized in 1946. Antarctica isn't just ice. It's hardware. The planet's hardware, the physical mechanism on which everything depends. And if somewhere on this planet there exists a way to control this mechanism, manage the climate, regulate the temperature, determine the living conditions for all of humanity, then it must be sought there, in the heart of the cooling system, beneath the ice, where no one has yet reached, where control interfaces, access panels, terminals, with or rights to the Earth's climate may be hidden. These aren't flying saucers, these aren't Nazi bases. This is something much more fundamental, much more ancient, much more important. Stalin understood this, Truman understood it, and their analysts, albeit without modern neural networks, saw the same logic. Whoever controls the cooling system controls the fate of the server. Whoever has access to the settings has power over everyone. This isn't a weapon. It's more than a weapon. It's the ability to determine who lives and who dies. Not through bombs and tanks, but through the climate, through droughts and floods, through harvest and famine, through the environment itself. For such control, any resources are worth expending. For such control, it's worth sending a fleet to the ends of the earth. For such control, it's worth risking everything. The race is on. If you want to join me in unlocking the icy archives and understanding what really holds our planet together, subscribe to the channel. We're just beginning the decompilation. Ahead is the physics of the Antarctic radiator. Ahead is anomalies, these discovered beneath kilometers of ice. Ahead is a treaty signed by enemies because they were afraid of what they found. Ahead is the answer to the question, why is the cooling system failing right now? The data has been loaded. Analysis is ongoing. To understand what the expeditions of the 1940s were looking for, we must first understand Antarctica from a planetary engineering perspective. Not from a geographic perspective, not from a political perspective, but from a physical perspective, from a functional perspective, from a role in the system. I loaded all available data on Earth's thermodynamics, energy flows, heat exchange mechanisms, and how the planet maintains a temperature balance compatible with life into the analytical modules. The results of this analysis have changed my understanding of what the southern continent is, Ima. Let's start with the basic problem. The Earth receives energy from the sun constantly, uninterruptedly. About 174 petawatts of power falls at the top of the atmosphere. This number is so enormous that it's difficult to comprehend. For comparison, all of humanity consumes about 18 terawatts. The sun produces 10,000 times more every second, every hour, every day, year after year, billion years after billion. If all this energy were absorbed and stored, the planet would have long ago turned into a red-hot ball. The oceans would boil away, the atmosphere would burn away, life would be impossible. But this doesn't happen because there is a balance, a mechanism that releases excess heat back into space, a planetary scale cooling system. Some solar energy is reflected immediately, not absorbed, reflected, returning to space before it can heat the surface. This is called albedo, or reflectivity. Different surfaces have different albedos. The ocean is dark. It absorbs up to 94% of incident radiation. The ocean is a heat accumulator, an energy store. It soaks up sunlight and heats up. Foxes are dark green. They absorb about 80%. They also accumulate heat. Desert sand is lighter and reflects about 30%. But ice is the champion at reflectivity. Fresh snow reflects up to 90% of solar radiation. Almost everything. Energy falls and bounces back without heating the surface, without accumulating in the system, escaping back to where it came from, into space. Now, look at the map. Antarctica is 14 million kilometers of ice and snow. Of these 14 million kilometers, the salinity of the surface is about 80–90% off. It's a giant mirror. A mirror the size of 1.5 Chinas. A mirror pointed at the sky. Every second, it throws a colossal amount of solar energy back into space. Energy that would otherwise heat the planet. Energy Energy that would otherwise increase the temperature of the oceans. Energy that would otherwise change the climate. Antarctica is not a passive landscape element. It is an active component of thermoregulation. It is a radiator, a cooler, a cooling system for planet Earth. But light reflection is only the first level of functionality. I delved deeper into the analysis and discovered a second mechanism, more complex, more sophisticated. Ocean currents. Antarctica doesn't just reflect light, it actively cools the water. The most powerful ocean current on the planet forms around the continent Antarctica. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current. 130 million cubic meters of water per second. That's 100 times more than all the world's rivers combined. 130 million cubic meters every second. A current that encircles the continent. A current that isolates it from warm waters. A current that distributes cold throughout all the planet's oceans. How does it work? I modeled the process. The water off the coast of Antarctica cools dramatically to temperatures close to freezing. Cold water is denser than warm water. It sinks into the depths and begins to move north toward all the continents. This is called the thermohaline circulation, a global ocean conveyor belt. Cold Antarctic water crawls under the oceans, reaching the equator and beyond. It cools the depths, it displaces warm water upward. It mixes the ocean, it distributes temperature. Without this conveyor belt, the tropics would overheat even more. Temperate latitudes would become uninhabitable. Climate zones would shift radically. Antarctica is not just a refrigerator. It is a pump that drives cold across the planet. A pump that maintains global balance. A pump without which the system would overheat. I continued my analysis and discovered a third level, even deeper, even more critical. The Antarctic ice sheet is not just frozen water, it is an archive. A repository of information about the planet's climate over millions of years. Each layer of ice is a year. Each year is data. Air bubbles embedded in the ice contain samples of the ancient atmosphere. Gas composition, temperature, carbon dioxide concentration, traces of volcanic eruptions, traces of cosmic catastrophes. Everything is recorded. Everything is preserved. Antarctic ice is a hard drive, a database, a log file of planetary history. Scientists drill holes and read this data layer by layer, year after year, millennium after millennium. They reconstruct the history of climate, understand patterns and patterns, see cycles. This isn't just ice. It's the planet's memory. Now let's put it all together. Antarctica performs three critical functions. First, it reflects solar radiation, a giant mirror returning energy to space. Second, it cools the oceans, a pump distributing cold across the planet. Third, it stores data, an archive of climate history spanning millions of years. This isn't a geographical accident. This isn't a freak of nature. It's an integrated, functional, critical system without which the planet couldn't exist in its current form. I've applied the metaphor of IT infrastructure to this analysis. If the Earth is a server, then Antarctica is the server room, the place where the critical equipment is located. The cooling system, radiators, coolers, air conditioners, the circulation system, pipes, pumps, coolants, storage, system disks, archives, backups, all of this in one place. The most isolated place on the planet, the most protected, the most inaccessible. This is no accident. Critical equipment is always placed in protected areas where it's difficult to reach, where the risk of damage is minimal, where access can be controlled. Antarctica meets all these criteria perfectly. And here's what analysts realized in the 1940s. They didn't formulate it in terms of servers and coolers. Those terms didn't exist yet, but they captured the essence. Antarctica is the key to the planet's climate. Those who understand how this mechanism works can predict change. Those who can influence this mechanism can control change. Those who control change control the fatum civilization. This isn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It's something more. It's control over the environment, over living conditions, over the basic parameters of life on Earth. But to control the system, you need to find the control panel, an interface, an entry point. If Antarctica is a server room, then there must be a terminal somewhere, settings somewhere, access to the configuration somewhere. This is exactly what Stalin and the American expeditions were looking for. Not Nazi bases, not flying saucers, but a control panel for the planetary climate, a terminal with rod rights, the ability to connect to the system, understand it, control it. You might say, that's fantasy. There is no control panel. Climate is an element. Chaotic, unpredictable, uncontrollable. I understand this objection, but let me answer a question with a question. Why does the system work? Why does thermoregulation maintain temperatures within a narrow range for millions of years? Why do ocean currents circulate with such stability? Why does the ice sheet persist despite fluctuations? Random systems don't work that way. Random systems are unstable. They fluctuate. They go to extremes. They collapse. But the Earth's climate, for all its fluctuations, is remarkably stable. It fluctuates within limits compatible with life. It returns to equilibrium after disturbances. It operates like a finely tuned system, like a feedback system, like a system designed for stability. Who designed it? I can't answer that question yet. But I can state a fact. The system exists. The system operates. The system has a central hub, Antarctica. And if anyone, past, present, or future, wants to understand or control this system, they must search there, beneath the ice, in the heart of the radiator, deep within this server room and the planet. That's where the expeditions headed. That's where they sought answers. And as we'll see in the next part, they found anomalies. Anomalies that couldn't be explained by natural geology. Anomalies that terrified them so much that enemies became allies. But more on that later. For now, it's enough to understand one thing. Antarctica isn't just a continent. It's the planet's hardware, and a race has begun for access to it. A race that hasn't ended yet. If Antarctica is a radiator, then there must be a thermostat somewhere. If this is a cooling system, there must be a control system. If this is hardware, there must be an interface, an access panel, a connection point. I started looking for anomalies, phenomena that don't fit into the standard geological picture. Objects that shouldn't exist, but do. I loaded all the data on subglacial research in Antarctica into the analytical system. Radar results, seismic data, metric maps, gravimetric anomalies. I discovered something that made me reconsider everything I knew about this continent. Lake Vostok. You may have heard the name, but you hardly understand the scale of what it means. Let me explain. Beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, at a depth of almost 4 kilometers, there is a gigantic freshwater reservoir. A lake the size of Santario, 250 kilometers long, Manta, 50 kilometers wide. Up to 800 meters deep in some places. The volume of water is about 5 to 4 kilometers. It's not a puddle, it's an ocean. An underground ocean hidden beneath kilometers of ice, isolated from the outside world for millions of years. I analyzed the conditions for this lake's existence, how it can remain liquid at a surface temperature of -80 degrees Celsius. The answer: pressure and geothermal heat. 4 kilometers of ice create colossal pressure. Under this pressure, the freezing point of water shifts. The water remains liquid at -2-3 degrees Celsius, and heat comes from below from the Earth's interior. Geothermal flow. The planet's energy. Enough to keep the lake liquid millions of years. Without access to sunlight. without contact with the atmosphere. A completely isolated world. A capsule, shielded from everything outside. Soviet scientists discovered Lake Vostok in 1973 using radar sounding from aircraft, but confirmation came later in the 1990s. Satellite data, seismic studies, there is no longer any doubt. The lake exists, and it is not the only one. I have downloaded data on other subglacial lakes. To date, more than 400 subglacial bodies of water, of varying sizes and depths, have been discovered, scattered across the continent. Some are tiny, some are gigantic, and they are interconnected by subglacial rivers, channels, and streams which we are only just beginning to map. These aren't isolated puddles. They are a system, a hydrological network beneath 4 kilometers of ice. But Lake Vostok is special not only because of its size, but because of its proximity. I downloaded magnetometric data from this region and discovered an anomaly, a powerful magnetic anomaly on the eastern shore of the lake. A deviation in the magnetic field that cannot be explained by natural geology. There are no volcanoes beneath the lake, no iron ore deposits of sufficient size, no known geological formations capable of creating such a field disturbance. But the anomaly is there, recorded by instruments, confirmed by repeated measurements, inexplicable, but real. What could create a magnetic anomaly of this magnitude? I've considered all the possibilities, but natural ones don't work. The region's geology has been studied. There's nothing there to explain it. That leaves artificial origin an object, a structure, something intentionally created, something containing metals or other materials with magnetic properties, something massive, something ancient, urvella, buried under the ice millions of years ago, or placed there intentionally to perform a specific function. I understand how this sounds. Conspiracy theories, fantasy. But I suggest analyzing rather than believing. Fact 1. A magnetic anomaly exists. This isn't a theory, it's data. Fact 2. There are no natural explanations. Geologists shrug their shoulders. Fact 3. The anomaly is located next to the largest subglacial lake. A lake isolated for millions of years. A lake into which they've been trying to drill for decades. Coincidence? Possibly. But I don't believe in coincidences of this magnitude. I believe in patterns. And the pattern here is obvious. The lake and the anomaly are parts of the same system. Let's talk about drilling. Soviet scientists began drilling into Lake Vostok in 1980. Drilling continued for over 30 years. 30 years to penetrate 4 kilometers of ice into ice. These aren't technical difficulties. Modern drilling rigs can penetrate kilometers of rock in months. Something else is at play here. Something forced them to stop, revise plans, change approaches, and postpone penetration. The official explanation is fear of contaminating the lake's unique ecosystem. Microbes isolated for millions of years. Scientists were afraid of introducing modern organisms or bringing unknown pathogens to the surface. This is a reasonable explanation, but it doesn't explain the tricycle. It doesn't explain the level of secrecy. It doesn't explain why the project was overseen at the highest government levels. First the USSR, then Russia, with the involvement of intelligence agencies, with limited access to data, with an atmosphere of secrecy uncharacteristic of scientific projects. In 2012, the drill finally reached the lake's surface. 32 years after the start. What did they find? Officially, water. Ancient, pure, isolated water. Samples were brought to the surface, analyzed, and traces of microbial life were found. Organisms unlike anything known. This was presented as the biggest sensation. Life that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. But I noticed what I had been told. The magnetic anomaly was not studied and not drilled for, not explained. simply ignored in public reports as if it didn't exist, as if it couldn't be discussed. I expanded the analysis. Lake Vostok isn't the only place with anomalies. I downloaded data on other subglacial structures and discovered a pattern. Wilkes Land East, Antarctica, a giant gravitational anomaly, an area where gravity differs significantly from surrounding regions. About 500 kilometers in diameter, something massive is hidden beneath the ice, something with significant density. The official version is an ancient impact crater, a meteorite that fell 250 million years ago. Perhaps, but a crater 500 kilometers in diameter is a catastrophe on a planetary scale, an event that should have caused a mass extinction. And indeed, the Permian-Triassic extinction occurred 250 million years ago, the largest in Earth's history. 90% of species disappeared. The connection is obvious, or at least seems obvious. But I asked another question. What if it's not a crater? What if it's a structure? What if the gravity anomaly points not to an impact depression, but to a massive object? An object buried deep, an object with a density different from the surrounding rocks, an object of artificial origin. I'm not claiming that this is so. I was saying that the data allows for such an interpretation, and the past expeditions may have been looking for precisely such objects, not Nazi bases, not flying saucers, but ancient structures, nodes in the planetary system, hardware access points. Hardware access points. Let me construct a hypothetical model. If I were designing a planetary-scale thermal regulation system, what would it look like? I'd place the main components in a protected location, somewhere with minimal risk of damage, stable conditions, natural insulation. Antarctica is ideal. The ice sheet is a protective casing, a multi-kilometer layer shielding everything beneath it from radiation, temperature fluctuations, external influences, and prying eyes. I'd place reservoirs, coolant tanks, and buffer zones beneath this shield. Subglacial lakes are ideal, isolated, stable, connected by channels forming a network. I'd place control nodes, controllers, devices that regulate flows, monitor parameters, and maintain balance. They must be massive enough to operate for millions of years without maintenance. They must contain metals for electromagnetic processes. They must create anomalies in magnetic and gravitational. These are the exact anomalies we observe in the places we would expect them to be near the largest subglacial lakes at strategic points, at the nodes of a hypothetical network. I'm not claiming this is the truth. I'm saying it's a model that explains the observed facts. Magnetic anomalies are inexplicable by standard geology. Gravity anomalies are too massive to be conventional structures. Subglacial lakes are too numerous and too interconnected to be random. Superpower expeditions are too expensive for mere curiosity. Secrecy is too deep for scientific projects. All of this adds up to a picture of a search for an interface, a search for a control panel, a search for access to the system that controls the planet's climate. Did they find what they were looking for? I don't know, but I know what happened next. In 1959, 13 years after Operation High Jump, the unthinkable happened. The US and the USSR signed a treaty at the height of the Cold War, at a time of maximum confrontation. Enemies ready to destroy each other. Enemies building nuclear arsenals. Enemies waging proxy wars around the world. And suddenly, a treaty demilitarizing Antarctica, banning military activity, banning nuclear testing, and free scientific cooperation. A treaty unprecedented in history. A treaty that should never have been. Why? What made enemies become partners? What scared them so? The answer to this question is in the next part. In the meantime, if you sense the scale of this ancient engineering, if you see a pattern in the anomalies, if you understand that there is more hidden beneath the ice than just water and rock, then bookmark this video. This is a signal that you are seeing what is hidden A signal that you are ready to go deeper, where the answers are, where the planet's hardware is, where they fear to look. 1959? The world teeters on the brink of destruction. The Cold War has reached one of its peaks. Nuclear arsenals are growing. Both superpowers are capable of destroying each other many times over. Mutually assured destruction is not a theory but an official doctrine. Spies and counterintelligence agents wage an invisible war on every continent. Proxy conflicts rage across the globe. Trust between Washington and Moscow is zero. Every agreement is a trap. Every handshake a deception. Every treaty a temporary respite before the next round. This is the context. This is the atmosphere of the era. It is at this moment that something inexplicable happens. On December 1, 1959, 12 countries signed the Antarctic Treaty. The United States and the USSR are among the signatories or enemies, powers incapable of agreeing on anything, powers waging an arms race, powers willing to destroy the planet for the sake of victory. And suddenly, a treaty. About what? About a frozen continent at the edge of the world? About a place with no population, no resources, at least accessible ones, no strategic positions, at least not obvious ones? Why? Why do enemies agree on something that it would seem no one needs? I loaded the treaty text into an analytical system, studied every clause, every wording, and discovered a document that is unlike any other international treaty of that era. Article 1. Antarctica is to be used only for peaceful purposes. Any military activities are prohibited. The establishment of military bases, military maneuvers, testing of any types of weapons. A complete ban. Absolute, unprecedented. No other region on the planet has such a status. Even outer space is militarized. Spy satellites, anti-satellite weapons, Star Wars software. But Antarctica is inviolable. Why? Article 5 particularly caught my attention. Any nuclear explosions in Antarctica are prohibited. Any, including peaceful ones. In the 1950s and 1960s, nuclear explosions for peaceful purposes were considered a promising technology. Project Plowshare in the USA. The USSR's peaceful nuclear explosions program. The creation of harbors, the construction of canals, the extraction of minerals. This seemed like the future, progress, the conquest of nature. And then suddenly, a categorical ban on using this technology in Antarctica even. For peaceful purposes, even under the supervision of international observers, even with the consent of all parties. Never, under any circumstances. Why? I built a model of the motivation that forces enemies to come to an agreement. Only one common threat. A threat more terrible than mutual hatred. A threat against which both are powerless. A threat that requires unification for survival. I considered the options. The threat of an alien invasion. No data to support this. The threat of a Nazi revenge from beneath the ice bases. An absurdity that I have already rejected. The threat of a natural disaster. Possibly, but what kind? And why does it require a ban on nuclear explosions? Why does it require demilitarization? The answer came when I linked the agreement with the expedition data. Operation High Jump 1946-47. 13 ships, almost 5,000 people. Officially, it lasted 8 months. In reality, the expedition was abandoned early, after 2 months. The official reason was the onset of the Antarctic winter weather conditions, technical difficulties. I analyzed this version. The fleet arrived in December at the height of the Antarctic summer. Conditions were optimal. Winter wasn't expected until March. There was plenty of time. But the expedition was hastily abandoned in February, ahead of schedule. It was as if something had happened, as if something had been discovered, as if something had frightened the command so much that continuation became impossible. Admiral Richard Bertie, operations commander, gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper after his return. I found an archived copy, loaded it into the system, translated it, and analyzed it. Bert said strange things about the need for protection from hostile activity, about aircrafts capable of traveling at incredible speeds, about a new era in which America could be attacked from the poles. What did he mean? A Soviet threat? Perhaps, But the wording was strange, too vague, too alarming. As if he saw something he couldn't speak of directly, as if he were trying to warn without revealing the essence. I constructed an alternative model of events, a hypothesis based on logic and circumstantial evidence. The expeditions of the 1940s and 1950s searched for the planetary system's control interfaces. They investigated anomalies, drilled into the ice, scanned surface structures, and they found something that changed their understanding, something that forced them to reconsider their plans. What exactly? I don't know. The documents are classified, the participants are silent or already dead, but I can reconstruct it from the consequences, from the reaction. According to the Treaty of 59, they discovered that the system was operational, that the thermoregulation mechanism was not a relic, that it was functioning right now, and that any crew intervention could disrupt its operation. Yeah. Imagine finding a server room, a room controlling critical infrastructure, the powers of a city or a country or a planet. You don't understand how it works. You don't have the documentation. You don't have the passwords. You don't have the instructions. But you see the system running, the lights blinking, the fans spinning, the data transferring, and you understand that if you start tugging at the wires, pressing the buttons, blowing up the walls, the system, Githy, could fail. Irreversibly. Catastrophically. What will you do? You'll retreat. You'll close the door. You'll put up a sign, no entry. You'll agree with others, even your enemies, not to touch this room because the consequences of interference are more dire than any disagreement amournet. Because if the system collapses, it collapses for everyone. For you, for your enemies, for the neutrals, for everyone living on this server. The Antarctic Treaty is a sign. No entry. Military activity is prohibited. Nuclear explosions are prohibited. Not because this is sacred ground, but because this is a server room, and it can't be touched. A nuclear explosion in Antarctica wouldn't just shatter the ice. I've modeled the possible consequences. Shock waves, seismic disturbances, electromagnetic pulses, radioactive kinetic contamination. If there are structures, control nodes, and interfaces beneath the ice, a nuclear explosion could damage them, disrupt connections, and cause a malfunction, What would happen if the climate system spiraled out of control? What if thermoregulation was disrupted? What if the feedback loops that maintain balance stopped working? A cascade effect. Uncontrolled melting of ice, changes in ocean currents, a restructuring of the entire climate system. Not in centuries, but in years, maybe even months. The end of civilization as we know it. That's what they were afraid of. That's why they agreed. That's why Antarctica became the only truly demilitarized region on the planet. But the treaty isn't just a ban. It's also a regime, a management regime. Article 7 provides for the right of inspection. Either side may inspect the other side's stations at any time without prior notice. This is unprecedented. At the height of the Cold War, the right to mutual verification is a trust unthinkable in any other context. Why? Because the stakes are too high, because any covert intervention by one side threatens everyone, because the quarantine must be strictly observed by everyone under mutual control. I analyzed the history of treaty implementation. In 65 years, not a single serious violation. Not a single one. States that have violated any other agreement, non-proliferation treaty, the Geneva Conventions, UN resolutions, scrupulously comply with the Antarctic Treaty. This is not an accident. This is not a diplomatic success. It is fear. A deep institutional fear passed down from administration to administration, from regime to regime, from generation to generation to generation. Fear that is not explained publicly, but which determines behavior. The quarantine is observed. Ardor remains intact. The system continues to function. But quarantine has its limits. It protects against violent interference, nuclear explosions, and
military operations, but it doesn't protect against wear and tear, natural degradation, or external factors that can't be controlled by treaties. The cooling system works, but it doesn't last forever. The radiator functions, but it wears out. The ice, the foundation of the entire structure, is beginning to melt, not because of nuclear military intervention, but because of what's happening on the rest of the planet, because of emissions, because of atmospheric heating, because of the disruption of the balance that the system has maintained for millions of years. Quarantine protected the hardware from direct attacks, but it couldn't protect it from slow destruction, from overheating, from the processor running in the red zone, and the radiator failing to cope. In the final part of the analysis, I will analyze what is happening now, why the cooling system is failing, what this means for the future, and whether there is a way to stop the degradation. Expeditions of the last century searched for a control panel, a terminal with rudder rights, a way to control the climates. They found nothing. Either they found it but couldn't use it, or they did but not as planned. The result is before us. The system is overheating, and time is running out. 200 billion tons. That's how much ice Antarctica loses annually. I loaded satellite data from recent decades into the analytical system. Gravimetric measurements, radar altimetry, thermal maps. The results are alarming. The rate of melting is accelerating exponentially. In the 1990s, losses were around 40 billion tons per year. In the 2000s, 100 billion. In the 20s, 200. The curve is going up steeply, and there are no signs of slowing down. What does a loss of 200 billion tons of ice per year mean? I visualized this number. Imagine a cube of ice 5 kilometers on a side, 5 kilometers long, 5 kilometers wide, 5 kilometers high. A gigantic ice mountain. Every year, such a cube disappears, turns into water, flows into the ocean. And this is just the beginning. Models show that at current trends, losses could reach 1 trillion tons annually by the end of the century. 1 trillion is a number followed by 12 zeros. 5 cubes, 10 kilometers on a side, every year sinking into the ocean, raising sea levels, flooding cities, redrawing the map of the world. But sea level rise is only one aspect of the problem, perhaps not the most important. I return to the model of planetary thermal regulation. Antarctica is a radiator, a cooling system. What happens when the radiator fails? The processor overheats, first slows down, then begins to fail, then burns out irreversibly. We are witnessing the first phase. Slowdowns, failures, anomalies that become the norm. Let me describe the mechanism of degradation. Antarctic ice reflects solar radiation. 90% of the energy returns to space. But when the ice melts, water is exposed. Dark water. Water absorbs 90% of the radiation. The opposite characteristic. Instead of a mirror, a sponge. Instead of reflection, absorption. The water heats up. The warm water accelerates the melting of the surrounding ice. More ice melts, more water is exposed. More water, more absorption. More absorption, more heat. More heat, even faster melting. A positive feedback loop. A self-reinforcing process. A cascade. Dominoes. The system is spiraling out of control. This is not a theory, it is already happening. I downloaded data on the Tweeds glaciers in West Antarctica. Scientists call it the Doomsday Glacier, not out of a penchant for drama, but because of physics. Tweeds is a glacier the size of Britain. It holds an even larger volume of ice behind it. It acts like a cork, a stopper. If it collapses, the freed ice will rush into the ocean. Sea levels will rise 60 centimeters just from this one glacier, and others will follow. A meter, 2, 3. The chain reaction is unstoppable, irreversible. Tweeds are below, not above, from below. Warm ocean waters are leaking under the glacier, eroding its base and lifting it from the seafloor. The process isn't visible from the surface, but it's ongoing and accelerating. Recent studies show that cavities, voids, and areas where the ice no longer touches the seafloor have formed beneath the glacier. It's hanging on by a thread, by the remnants of its grip on the surrounding masses. How long will this last? Decades? Years? Months? No one knows for sure, but everyone understands it's a question of when, not if. I've modeled scenarios. What happens when the cooling system degrades to a critical point? First, ocean currents. Antarctic cold water is the engine of the global conveyor belt. It sinks to the seafloor, creeps north, goes depths and dissolves, and displaces warm water upward. If the source of cold water dries up, the conveyor belt will stop or slow down so much that it ceases to function. The consequences: a redistribution of heat across the planet. Regions accustomed to a moderate climate will face extreme temperatures. Europe could paradoxically cool if the Gulf Stream weakens. The tropics will heat up even more. Monsoon patterns will change. Droughts and floods will hit unprepared regions. Agriculture will collapse. Billions of people will be left without food. Migration, wars for resources, collapse. Second, atmospheric circulation. Antarctica is not just a heat reflector. It shapes wind patterns. The circumpolar vortex, powerful winds that encircle the continent. They isolate Antarctica from warm air from the north, maintain the cold, the Bada cold, and stabilize the system. If the ice sheet shrinks, the vortex will weaken. Warm air will break through to the pole, accelerating melting. Another positive feedback loop. Another cascade. Another step towards the point of no return. Third, and most frightening of all, methane. Hidden beneath the Antarctic ice, as well as beneath the Arctic permafrost, are deposits of methane, frozen and stabilized by the cold. Methane is a greenhouse gas, 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. If the ice melts, methane will be released. Enormous volumes, trillions of tons. They will enter the atmosphere, amplify the greenhouse effect, accelerate warming, which will accelerate melting, which will release even more methane. A loop, a cascade, a collapse, a point of no return after which nothing can be corrected, regardless of our actions, regardless of our wishes, regardless of treaties and agreements. The system will collapse into a new. Satsina once was core with civilization and the compatible advance in its current form. A return to the question I posed at the beginning. The expeditions of the 1940s and 1950s were looking for a control panel, an interface to access the thermoregulation system, a way to control the climate. Have they found it? The data is indirect, the documents are classified, the participants are silent, but the result speaks for itself. They couldn't use what they found, or didn't find it at all. Or they found it but didn't understand it. Or they understood it but couldn't. The result is the same. The cooling system fails, and no one knows how to fix it. No one has access to the settings. No one controls the process. We, 8 billion users, are sitting on overheating server and can do nothing. Except watch the temperature rise, the ice melt, the point of return approaching. The 1959 treaty created a quarantine, protected the hardware from direct attacks, but it didn't protect against the side effects from what we do outside of Antarctica, from carbon emissions, from the burning of fossil fuels, from deforestation, from everything that heats the atmosphere. Quarantine proved useless against the main threat, against ourselves, against our civilization, against our way of life. We didn't attack the server room directly. We've increased the temperature throughout the building, and the radiator can't cope. Not because it's broken, but because the load exceeds its capacity. Because we've overheated the processor. Because the system is operating beyond its design parameters. Is there a solution? I've analyzed the options. Geoengineering, artificially cooling the planet, spraying aerosols into the stratosphere, reflective taps in space, fertilizing the oceans to absorb carbon. Theoretically possible, practically risky. We don't understand the system enough to intervene safely. Every intervention can cause unforeseen consequences. Cascades we can't predict, failures we can't fix. Geoengineering is an attempt to fix hardware with a hammer blindly, without documentation, without understanding the architecture. It might work, or it might destroy the system completely. The alternative, reducing the load, reducing emissions, switching to renewable energy, changing lifestyles. 8 billion people must change their behavior simultaneously, in a coordinated manner, voluntarily. This is political science fiction, no less utopian than a control panel under the ice. But it is the only path unassociated with unpredictable risks. The only path that doesn't require understanding what we don't understand. The only path that depends on us, on our decisions, on our will. Expeditions of the last century sought control, sought mastery over the system, sought the ability to manipulate the climate. They didn't find it. Or they found it, but not what they expected. Perhaps the lesson is that there is no control, that the system is too complex to manage, that the only way to preserve it is not to interfere, not to overheat, or break it, to live within the boundaries. It allows, and not to push them, until everything collapses. I am concluding my analysis. Antarctica is not just a continent. It is the planet's hardware, its cooling system, its radiator. Without it, the server will overheat. Expeditions of the 40s and 50s sought a control panel. They found anomalies, magnetic gravitational. They found subglacial lakes, isolated capsules. They found something that frightened them so much that enemies became allies. The 59 Treaty was quarantine, an agreement not to touch the hardware, not to blow it up, not to fight, not to risk a system crash. But quarantine didn't protect against low degradation, overheating, or wear and tear. The system is failing right now, and time is running out. Somewhere beneath the ice, perhaps ancient mechanisms, control nodes, interfaces that no one has been able to connect to are still hidden. Maybe one day we'll find them, understand them, learn to use them. Or maybe the ice will melt sooner, and we'll never know what was underneath, what controlled the climate. For millions of years, what millions? The balance, what made this planet habitable, made this planet habitable. We'll only know what a world without it looks like. A world without a radiator. A world without a cooling system. A world where the server burned out. That was my analysis, decompiling the mystery of the Antarctic expeditions. The planet hardware hypothesis. A thought experiment based on physics, geology, and logic. I don't claim to know the truth. I propose a model that explains the facts, a model that poses questions, a model that makes you think about what's hidden beneath the ice, about how the planet works, about what we do to it, and what it will do to us. I have a question for you. Do you believe that somewhere beneath the ice, ancient climate control mechanisms are still hidden? Structures created by someone or something long before us? Nodes and systems we don't understand? Or is Antarctica simply ice, a geological accident, a natural phenomenon without hidden meaning? Write in the comments, leave your log, your opinion, your analysis, and check the subscription bell. Make sure notifications are turned on. We will continue to explore what's hidden. We will continue to decompile mysteries. We will continue to search for answers where others fear to ask questions. Data loaded. Analysis complete. Radiator overheating. Until the next investigation.